Almost every organization wants to become more data-driven in their hiring. But how much data is actually too much data? How do you start measuring the outcomes of your hiring process? And how do you avoid decision paralysis in your hiring process? That's what we're going to cover in today's episode of Systematic Hiring. Let's go. Hi everyone, and welcome back to our webinar series on systematic hiring. I'm Kajsa Asplund, lead people science at Alva Labs. And in this series, we're exploring how organizations can move from process to system in hiring. That is, how can we move from a static and linear way of working with recruitment to a more interconnected, ever-evolving, ever-improving way that makes hiring accurate and easy. And I think we can all agree that a key ingredient to an evidence-based and successful way of hiring is data. And every time almost that I talk to a TA team today, they talk about how they want to become more data-driven in their hiring. But as we collect more and more data, new questions start to emerge. How much data is actually too much? When can the quest for certainty actually slow us down? And is there a trade-off to be made here between humanity and data in hiring? With us to unpack this today, we have Tim Knutsson, Head of Talent Intelligence at Academic Work. And for those of you who don't know Tim, he has been working in the fields of TA, HR, and organizational development for well over a decade. And he is leading Academic Work's transition towards a more evidence-based and scientific way of working with hiring, where you actually have the outcomes at the center. Most welcome, Tim. So great to have you with us.
Thank you. Very nice being here, Kajsa.
Fantastic. So before we head into today's topic, you have a really cool title, Head of Talent Intelligence.
Right.
What does that actually mean to you?
Well, what does it mean? Well, often talent intelligence is referred to the strategic use of the data, technology, in business intelligence, basically, in organizations to make better decisions when it comes to hiring outcomes. And that is one of my prime sort of focuses. But in addition to only focus on academic work, I focus on all our clients and sort of making sure those insights are coming to use. The second part of my role is basically translating those insights into an evidence-based and really reliable state-of-the-art recruitment process for academic work, so make sure we find top talents to our clients.
That's so fascinating. And I'm going to jump to unprepared follow-up questions right away. I would be curious to hear, like, what's your story into that issue? How did you become interested and fascinated in this sort of metrics-driven, outcome-focused way of hiring?
Very good question. I think I more or less have stumbled into it. Because at heart, I think everyone that knows me says that I'm a real recruitment nerd. Ever since I started with recruitment, I have always looked at better ways of doing what we do to understand, like, how can we optimize hiring decisions? How can we make better decisions? How can we make sure we actually predict the performance of an upcoming hire? And in the end, sort of it comes down to data, comes down to standardizations, and come down to sort of making sure you can measure and verify what you do. So that is how I got into it. I started like years back with my master's, and then I have just worked with recruitment continuously, as you said, over a decade now. And I have become more and more like detail focused and focused on the small perfections that makes the actual biggest impact.
Fascinating. And that, I think, brings us to today's topic. And the fact that you mention here, which should be obvious and self-evident, but sad as it seems, it's not. Namely, the fact that we should try to measure the outcomes of our hiring process, right? So by that, we refer to how do our hires fare? Do they stay? Do they perform? And drawing on your experience, what are some of the most common mistakes that customers or companies make when they try to measure hiring outcomes?
I can talk forever about that, but I would say like the most common one is not measuring at all, like due to internal blockers or lack of resources. But if we focus on the fact that there are actually people that are measuring it, I see three very common mistakes. The first one is actually not defining the hiring outcome you're wishing for, because there are not many that understand that our hiring outcomes differ. There are many different ways of looking at it. It can be like measuring task performance, but it can also be measuring organizational citizenship behavior or retention or counterproductive work behaviors. So defining what you actually want to assess is key. But a lot of people don't do that. And then they just use like a general assessment of outcome, which isn't validated or reliable, which means that you aren't really measuring anything. The second mistake I often see is that you lack standardization when it comes to input variables. With that, I mean that you perhaps have an outcome that you measure well. For example, let's take task performance. We measure it well. But then you have no standardization and no quantitative data to go back to from the recruitment process. Like you only had free text, for example, in your interviews, or you haven't standardized how you measure skills. So then it's very hard to understand like what generated the hiring outcome we actually got. And the last one I would say is related to you hire or you measure too much. There are so many metrics you can actually measure, but then when you actually do it, two things happen or can happen. If you assessing hiring outcome using like supervisor ratings, if you ask them to assess too much, well, they get exhausted, and then they're getting no responses, and then you have nothing to work with. Or you get so much data that it becomes so complex and so heavy that you don't have the resources or you don't have the time to work with it. So then you don't do anything with it.
Exactly. So the data quality goes down and there is sort of this drowning in data situation, right? There were so much gold in this answer. I think we need to unpack some of the aspects that went in there. If we start from the top, you were talking about how companies sometimes don't really define the outcome in a very good way. And I think you touched on something really important there, which is that job performance today is not one thing, right? It's very multifaceted. So for those who don't know these terms, when we talk about task performance, we usually talk about how someone's performing on the actual job, if you will. So for a salesperson, what are your sales numbers looking like? Are you delivering on time? Can you do the thing, right?
Yeah.
But then we have citizenship behavior, which is another aspect. Could you just briefly explain what that means?
Well, briefly, it is everything aside from your work tasks that bring value to your organization. So it can be, for example, how you help your colleagues, or if you stay late, or if you engaged in sort of building the company culture. And those are factors that brings a lot of value to an organization, but isn't directly tied to your work description.
Exactly. So all those things beside the job description that you do that brings value. That's a great explanation. And then you also mentioned counterproductive work behavior.
Yes.
Could you also explain why that goes into like job performance?
Well, that's sort of the other side of the coin, so to say. It's when you are looking at sort of the bad aspects of work performance, so to say. Like if you look into how if your employees are late, if they are creating trouble, like both physical but also like psychological for other coworkers. So it's basically when you look at work performance, you can say that you look at task performance plus organizational citizenship behavior squared or minus counterproductive work behaviors. And that can be very relevant to look at for certain jobs where sort of performance is kind of limited or the variation is slow or minimal. So then it's more relevant to actually look at, are they reliable? So that's another aspect.
Yeah, exactly. So being a bit more like precise on what you mean when you talk about job performance is one step towards a better measurement of the outcomes then.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. And then you were also talking about the fact that some organizations don't really have good enough data on the incoming variables, if you will, the input variables. And you mentioned interview data briefly here. Could you explain what would be the difference between like high quality interview data that can be used to measure the outcomes and low quality interview data?
Absolutely. I would say that a lowest form, perhaps, of interview data, which is very hard to handle and work with, is 100% like unstructured data. Like no standardized questions and no grading models. It's just basically asking different questions to different candidates all the time.
And almost, perhaps sometimes not even writing down the notes, right? It just exists in the hiring manager's head.
Exactly. And then on the other side of that spectrum is then very structured, standardized method of collecting the information you need. So for example, if you want to assess a certain skill, well, then you have standardized questions to actually assess that. And then each question has its own grading model, like for example, 1 to 5, but also each number should have a clear definition of what it means. So it means the same to me as it does to you, because otherwise you risk creating like a low quality data point, which is also like dangerous to work with. So I would say that that is the other extreme of the spectrum.
And then you have everything in between, obviously.
And then you have everything in between.
Super fascinating. We're really curious about how this looks in your organizations as well. So maybe let's go to the first poll question of today's webinar, where we're asking you, how would you describe your hiring data today? Is it scattered across tools and platforms? Is it collected but not used? Or is it connected to business impact? And we can see here from the numbers that the clear majority say that it's scattered across tools and platforms, coming in at 59%, or even 60 maybe. Tim, what's your reaction to that result?
Well, I'm not surprised.
You're not surprised?
No, to be honest. And it's too bad that that is the fact. But that's often the reality of most like hiring platforms today. You have often like silos when it comes to hiring data. You have some data in your ATS, you have some data in your HRIS systems, you have some data somewhere else in a customer success management system or something like that.
In a Word document?
In a Word document, OneNote. And that makes it very hard to work with it structurally. And I would say that is the main issue, as we also see from the poll, that many companies are facing.
Exactly. So not that surprising then. So I want to switch gears a little bit here. We've established that high quality data is a must-have to get this right. But there's also perhaps a bit of a paradox here, because sometimes more data can actually equal worse hiring decisions, right? When would like more data actually make hiring decisions worse?
It's a very good question, and we already stumbled into it a little bit. But for me, it's definitely sort of an easy definition. It's when data stops bringing additional value, or when you don't really have a reliable way of working with the data you have collected. In psychology, usually we talk about like information bias, when you believe that more information will sort of equals better decisions. But in reality, most information is just noise. It's sort of blurs your perception of what is important, which actually worsen your ability to make the right decision. So that is a real common issue, I would say. And what you should instead do is always to start small. Like identify one key data point that you know is relevant, and then start measuring it. And once you understand it, then you can add additional one, and then continue that way. But many companies I see, they want to start with everything at once, and then you can't work with it, and you don't really understand it.
Exactly. I think that's so fascinating, and I think we can all probably relate to that situation when you're sitting there at the end of a hiring process with all these different data points. Some are structured, some are not. Some are just something you heard about the candidate somewhere, and now it's sort of gotten stuck in your head and you can't get rid of it. And for some reason, it seems so important now, although we didn't put it down as a part of the job description in the beginning, right?
Exactly.
And that's also how the human brain works, right? We can get really caught up with information that comes in for reasons that have nothing to do with the job description or the ability to actually do the job, right?
Yeah. And it has such a powerful effect on us. As you mentioned, like you could be in the end of the recruitment process, and then you get like a final talk with the client or like hiring manager about the person you're aim to hire, and then perhaps something come up in the reference check, and then the hiring manager just had an incident with that particular thing was so important. So then all value, everything is just connected to that small piece of information that in reality doesn't have any impact on the actual performance of that consultant, because perhaps it's a different type of role, or it's going to be in a different department. So unfortunately, we're very susceptible to that kind of information if we don't have a structured way of working with the data along the recruitment process.
Exactly. And I guess that's also one of the big benefits of working with structured interviews, right? That if you follow that kind of protocol, you actually only get the information that you were looking for, and not all of these side tracks that might be interesting on a personal level, but not really predictive of job performance.
Exactly.
Fascinating. Another question that often comes up when it comes to data-driven hiring, and perhaps particularly when we're talking about tests and measuring potential early in the process, is that there's this perhaps apprehension that you might measure too much. Would you say that there is a scenario where you cross the line and measure too much at that early stage of the process?
I would say everything we assess during a recruitment process must have value and relevance. So if you are keen and good at understanding, like, okay, what should a person do in the position? How do they do it in a good way? And then based on that, choose both hard skills and soft skills. You have a very good like framework of what you should look at. I would say like very few roles, if any, requires you to look at all aspects of personality, like all facets of personality. Is usually just a couple of ones that are most relevant for you to actually be able to do your work task in the most efficient way possible. But if you then start looking at all aspects, or aspect that doesn't have relevance, then I would say, then you are crossing a line, just as you would add additional hard skills. So that's something you need to be careful with, because that's something I also see very commonly, that perhaps you have had a process, you have set the right traits or a test profile, but then in the end, you look at everything.
Exactly.
And have discussions about everything. And then again, we fall into the information bias, and then we risk doing less valid decisions.
Yeah, to be sure. And we're also restricting our talent pool unnecessarily, right? By adding all of these demands early on in the process.
Yeah.
I think I see that time and time again, not least with extroversion, for instance, where some managers have they have a real affinity for extroversion, if I may say so, and where you imagine that this must be a big benefit, being energetic and being very gregarious and outgoing, etc. But when you look at the job description, it's actually not that central.
Yeah.
So that would be, I guess, an example.
Very much so.
If leaders worry that data makes hiring cold, if you will, if they worry about losing the humanity of the hiring process by adding these data-driven methods, how would you persuade them that it can actually be quite the opposite?
I'm laughing because this is such a relevant discussion, like a relevant topic. For me, it's always sort of come down to like the paradox when it comes to hiring, because we know that structured, standardized way of working with high quality data is the best way to make hiring decision. But on the other side, like of this paradox, is that we as humans are hardwired to want like social proof and connection. And the trick here is to balance that by understanding sort of, okay, but what does, for example, like being humane mean in a recruitment process? Because from my end, or how I see it, it's like related to fairness, justice, and compassion. And I definitely don't see those traits. For example, when you request a candidate to spend hours on writing a resume, a cover letter, and then spending 30 seconds on rejecting that without giving any reasons why you did it, that is not just, it's not fair, and it's definitely not compassionate.
No.
And the same with interviews. If you sort of take the time from a candidate to perform unstructured interviews, which is littered with bias and noise, and then make a hiring decision without sort of understanding how wrong you've been, that is not just, it's not fair, and it's not compassionate. On the other side, if you are actually serious with your recruitment, you're actually doing a real good job description, you're choosing the right requirements, and then you choose valid objective tools to actually assess this, well, that is just, fair, and compassionate, as long as you explain why. Because if you don't explain why you have chosen these traits and how, like why you're using this sort of selection method to collect that information, it's very hard from a candidate's point of view to perhaps understand, like, okay, why do I get a test now? And definitely also when you reject, you have to be super clear in why this candidate didn't proceed. What did he lack based on the requirements you had set? And if you have like strong data, this is no problem. This is easy to refer to. Like we expected this level, for example, of knowledge in this type of skill. But unfortunately, in our assessments, you didn't reach that level, unfortunately. But we really appreciated the time and so on. But this is definitely where I see the biggest mistakes are being made by companies and recruiters, because they don't explain the why. And that leads to a misconception of tests, for example, being very cold, because they don't understand why.
Exactly.
But for me, it's so much more humane to work with objective, standardized tools, because they are fair and they are just and they are compassionate, compared to other selection methods. For example, like coffee talk or a grandfather interview, when you have so much unstructured information, so much bias, and not a reliable way to actually assess what you want to assess, if you even know what you want to assess. So that was a long answer, but I feel very strongly about this.
Yeah, I can tell. I can tell that this is a heartfelt one for you, Tim. And I couldn't agree more, obviously. And I mean, listening to you reasoning around this, I get this feeling that maybe hiring is to some extent like framed in the wrong way in the minds of both hiring managers and candidates, in the sense that it's still viewed to a high extent as this social event of meeting and getting to know you as a person, where really what we're doing here is like a professional evaluation, right? And that does not mean that the sort of reception that you get shouldn't be super nice and feel good and all of that. But maybe we somehow need to reframe hiring into what it actually is, which is like a professional evaluation where we are trying to predict your potential to perform in this role, right? When you look at it that way, it becomes so much more like self-evident that you need a more structured approach.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And as you said, like, that doesn't mean that you can't be compassionate along the way. All great recruiters are. Like, they can explain why and can reject candidates, but they trust the assessment they have done. They trust the tools they have used. They can back it up very clearly. And if you can do that, well, then it shouldn't be a problem. But unfortunately, that goes back to the fact, as we start discussing this, that many companies today lack like structured ways of assessing. They lack this data-driven approach to recruitment. And then it becomes scary and hard to actually reject or motivate why you have chosen which tools and how you have assessed certain requirements.
Certainly. And speaking of obstacles, it's time for our second poll of the webinar, which is about this very topic. What's your biggest hinder to using hiring data effectively? Is it too many disconnected metrics? Is it leadership not being aligned? Is it lack of the right tools, poor data quality, or hiring managers going rogue? And here we can see that it's actually a tie here between the two most common answers, which are too many disconnected metrics and lack of the right tools. So if we start out here with too many disconnected metrics, Tim, what would be your playbook?
No, but it was good actually. It connects back to the other poll, and from my perspective, you can do a lot with simple tools. Like, this doesn't have to be complicated. Like, if you have disconnected data, then you can gather it in an Excel. And it doesn't have to be like super complex, but you can control it, you can work with it, and then you can sort of drive for a more long-term change. I know it's hard, and I know it perhaps will take more time, but it's worth it. Like, at academic work, I spent, I think, 3 years managing a master Excel. Like, this was years back, where we looked at sort of all the data of different types of like assessments we did, and then how we should validate that towards performance outcomes, because we didn't have a support for it.
Right.
And it connects to the other sort of part of the poll, like lack of good tools. And I would say, like, today, most commercial ATS used in the organization we have, they aren't built this way. They aren't built to support an evidence-based recruitment process.
Right.
They are built to scale and to support a more, perhaps, unstructured gut feeling approach. And then it's perhaps even more important that you internally work with setting what questions do we want? How do we want to assess them? And if you can get that into your ATS, great. But otherwise, like, work with an Excel. Like, have that as your sort of scorecard or evaluation tool until you can find something better.
Right. So very concretely for a hiring process, just setting up the different stages of the selection process, noting down what weight they should carry towards the end score, if you will, and just enter all the different scores from the different systems in there.
Yeah. That was actually how I started many years back when I was a recruitment consultant. I felt like that we lack a good way of weighting or aggregating the different tools. So just as you said, like, I created a very simple like scorecard where you had the requirements on one side, and then you have your candidate upside, and then you just added like quantified numbers of the different requirements you put in. And then you had a sort of weighting calculation based on more like general data. I used the classic Smith & Hunter 1998, which we now know is perhaps not the best one. But still, it worked because we also looked into it. We worked with it in our team and realized like, okay, we need to adjust some parts of it because we saw from the outcome that we needed to do, we could do better. So starting with that is not hard, and it really helps your hiring decision, both from your perspective, you understand and learn, but also to motivate towards line managers or clients that, hey, you know what? Look at these two candidates. This is the strength. This is the weaknesses of this one. This one is better because experience is crap. So when we look at knowledge level, it's much better and the potential. So this is the candidate to go with.
Exactly. So when speaking of hiring metrics, is there any like useless metric that you would like to see thrown out the window, or at least like taken down in importance?
From my point of view, I don't like time to hire. At least not as a standalone like outcome metric, which is usually used as, because if you use instead, for example, fill rate, quality of hire, and cost of hire, time to hire becomes redundant and only makes you focus on sort of the wrong things.
Interesting.
It definitely can work as a supporting metric, but a mistake I very commonly see is that that's the outcome metric you look at because it's perhaps simpler to measure.
Exactly.
I am also a little bit allergic to like every metric that starts with number or number up.
Right.
For example, like number of interviews. Because if you are really serious in wanting to build an evidence-based recruitment process, you have to build it for adaptability, like based on the conditions you have and based on the requirements you set. So for some processes, you should have a lot of interviews, but for some, perhaps zero interviews. So focusing on instead like outcome and not micromanaging the process, that is what I would put my time on instead.
Fascinating. If we look to the future a little bit then, fast forward 5 years, I think we can both agree that the pace of change is not going to slow down. We're in the middle of an AI transformation, and a lot of factors in the sort of geopolitical and macro environment are extremely uncertain right now. Looking a few years ahead, what do you think will be the problems facing the companies that are not able to make this transition to a more systematic hiring approach?
Well, what we have seen working like in this approach is that, or let me turn around, like if you don't do this, you will never be able to actually find and hire the best candidates. But perhaps more, I wouldn't say more important, but more perhaps acute is the fact that you can't really harvest the full potential of AI if you haven't a structured, systematic approach of working with hires. Because AI or the algorithms used by AI are 100% dependent on the data input. And if the data input is garbage, well, the output will be as well. And the only way to actually create like a systematic, well-functional recruitment process is to continuously feeding that AI with relevant information so it learns and develops. And then, of course, then correct your recruitment process accordingly. Because as you mentioned, we are in a landscape now, that the business landscape where everything is changing so fast. And things that you did 6 months ago will most likely be very irrelevant. So if you trust a process you built 2 years ago, well, then it's going to be problematic.
To be sure. To be sure. And I really love how you bring up also the potential of AI in this context, right? Because many of the things that we have been talking about today, like creating these feedback loops where you learn from the outcome data, etc., haven't really been possible in practice for most companies, but they can be now, given the power of AI, right? So on the flip side, what do you see will be the advantages for those companies that make this transition?
Well, from my point of view, at least, they will be the last one standing, because they will have such a high business impact. Like companies that don't adapt to this approach will stagnate, or they will die, because they will continue to not grow, and they will not be productive because they will find average or miss hires. But if you're actually serious in this, well, then you will find the best candidates. You will be able to move very quickly because you can reuse data, and you can build a very qualitative candidate pool. And you, in the end, also can continuously learn and adapt your recruitment process when the landscape is continuously changing. Like, you will learn from each process you do how you can do better, and that will be required. So yeah, that's how I see it, at least.
Super fascinating. We're almost wrapping up here. We've covered a lot of ground in this discussion. If people would just remember one thing from what we've talked about today, what do you think is the most important takeaway?
I would say, like, to get started, because many people get overwhelmed when we talk about data and like evidence-based hiring in this sense. But for me, it's a very simple approach to it. Like, what you really need to start doing is defining and start measuring the outcome you want. And that can differ in your company. Sometimes different departments have different outcomes that you need to consider, but start easy. Just start with, for example, defining quality of hire. What is that in our company? How should we measure it? And then start doing it. Because once you have done that, then you can start reflecting on your own recruitment process. Then you can see, like, okay, based on the steps we have in our recruitment process, what actually leads to this outcome? And if we see that it does not, okay, should we change it or should we remove it? And then continues to start validating that approach. And validating might also sound dangerous, but most LLM agents and just simple use of like ChatGPT or handling that easy correlations in a very good way. So that's something you can use straight away.
Oh, exactly.
So that's sort of, if I want you to take something with you, start measuring the outcome. And then you can start reflecting and understanding your own recruitment process and how you make sure you actually reach that outcome.
Exactly. So start small and start with the end in mind. Yes. That's wise advice from Tim Knutsson. With that, we're moving into our very exciting Q&A. And let's have a look here if we have some questions. 1 second here. So first off, how do you handle resistance from people who feel data might replace their judgment or experience?
I fully understand that question. And it is a struggle, I would say, we face every day. And the purpose, or how you should frame it, is that you shouldn't see it as replacing your judgment. It should inform your decision. It should help you take better decisions. So it's not that we say, like, hey, you can't do this judgment. It's more or less like, hey, here you have better tools to make better decisions. You can, like, in worst case, like, you can choose if you want to use it or not. But so we don't frame it as, hey, you do it wrong. This is the right way. Deal with it. More or less, like, as I said, like, work with the hiring manager. Make them understand that this is just meant to help you find better employees to your department, like focusing on the outcome. Like they don't want to hire bad employees. So this is just a tool to help them.
Exactly. And just a quick reflection on that is also that when hiring managers start realize that this more structured approach actually means going deeper, like fewer judgments, if you will. My experience is that they start getting more excited then, because what are you doing in a structured interview if not applying your judgment, right? You are there to dig deep on a few criteria that we have defined as absolutely critical for this role, right? And if you're doing your job right, you should go extremely deep and try to paint an as nuanced picture as you can of this person's ability to, I don't know, drive top of funnel leads or whatever it might be, right? And that's a really exciting way to use your judgment too.
Yeah.
Interesting. So next question up. Let's see here. That where you go. I agree with everything you're saying and how you're saying it. However, managers wish to make the best decisions, meaning that after having met candidates, they ask new questions related to an individual. How should a TA respond to that? Managers wish to know more outside the requirement profile and understandably so, but still it's outside of what we have decided. Yeah, so very much in line with what we have discussed here. I don't know if you have any pointers, Tim.
No, but I feel I feel our TA departments, because I know their reality, and in many companies they have not the most appreciated role, which I believe they definitely should have. And sometimes they aren't in a position where they can sort of dictate hiring decisions. They have to sort of rely or correct their way of working to the line manager. And again, my approach would never be to engage in like a conflict. It's more or less like always to try to understand, like, okay, why is this important now? What are you trying to understand using these questions that we haven't covered with all the other questions? How are these questions connected to the requirement profile we set? Because I believe that is a much better way of sort of getting them to realize perhaps their, I won't say faulty judgments, but their way of thinking perhaps isn't the best place to look at it in the hiring interview or hiring phase. And then sort of from a practical level, then always have follow-ups after like a recruitment process is done. Always make sure to evaluate your cooperation with the hiring manager, recapping this and making sure then it doesn't happen until like in the next recruitment process. But I know it's hard and this takes time. As we talked about before this, like these changes aren't just going to happen overnight. You have to fight for it, and you have to fight for it for a long time to get people on board. So it starts by taking place in organization, showing your expertise as a TA organization, and then slowly try to correct the behaviors that you believe the hiring managers perhaps are doing wrong.
Exactly. And I really like your point also about like showing an understanding of their motivations and where they're coming from in wanting to seek this additional information, but then maybe reminding them of Kahneman's thinking fast and slow and what bias is all about. So great response there. Let's see what else we've got here. This will be the last question. How do you decide which metrics actually matter versus what's just noise? And to build on Katarina's question above, how do we make sure the way we measure success is aligned with hiring managers? So we've talked a little bit already about the sort of signal versus noise question. But what would you say, Tim? How do you recognize a good data point to use in selection?
I'm going to try to answer this without going too much into statistics. But, a good data point is, now we go into basic at least, statistics. A good data point is valid and reliable, meaning that when you measure it 2 times, you basically get the same answer.
Yep.
And that answer is actually the answer to your question.
Mm.
So if I want to sort of understand how deep knowledge does Kajsa have in interview technique, well, then you frame a question, you frame like a framework to assess, and then you assess Kajsa, and then you perhaps have an additional tool to assess knowledge, like a knowledge test that is very valid, and then you sort of compare the results. It's called inter-rater correlation, but then you know that it's actually reliable. But an easier way to do it, perhaps, is just to start working with that type of question and then discussing the outcome of the measurement with a subject matter expert.
Yeah.
Like understanding, like, okay, now we measured, I gave Kajsa a 3 in interview technique. Okay, you as an expert, would you grade her a 3 based on this answer? And then you can sort of slowly start improving your tools.
Yeah, exactly. And everything doesn't have to be perfect to begin with, obviously. This needs to be a process, but you need to start somewhere.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. That concludes our Q&A, and it also concludes our webinar. So to wrap up, 3 findings or 3 takeaways from this discussion. More isn't always better. What you need are the right data points, the valid and reliable ones. Number 2, combine your data points to avoid drowning in data and become a lot more predictive in your hiring. And number 3, start small. Pick one metric, one silo to sort of break down, 2 data sources to combine in this quarter and get going. If you missed our product webinar last week, where we talked about how you can actually get going with systematic hiring with Alva, you will find the link in the follow-up email. With that, have a great weekend. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you, Tim, for joining our webinar.
Thank you for being here.